Hi, Elizabeth. Thank you for joining us as Collective Action Magazine and agreeing to be a part of this wonderful movement where we want to change the landscape in terms of gender-based violence within the context of South Africa. And hopefully from South Africa, we can also impact the world. I also want to welcome Tracey Kotzen, who's the CEO of Mental Wellness and the chief editor of Collective Action Magazine. I'm Hazel Namponya. I'm actually the editor of Collective Action Magazine. And with us today, we've got Elizabeth Dartnall. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Dartnell.
Dartnall. Dartnell. She's the executive director of the SVRI, which is the Sexual Violence Research Initiative in South Africa. Welcome, Elizabeth. Just tell us a bit about yourself and how you came into to become a part of SVRI and the executive director. What has been your journey?
Thank you so much, Hazel, for this opportunity, and it's lovely to be on the call with you, Hazel, and Tracey. So I'm delighted to be here, and it's really exciting to have an opportunity to talk about the Sexual Violence Research Initiative. My journey, I came to South Africa in 1993 and been on and off. I've been journeying through different various careers and have never really decided what I wanted to be when I grow up. So I'm still on that journey. But at the moment, my on my journey to what I want to be doing in the world is really to address, the injustices in the world and to work on acknowledging that me as a white woman have so much privilege and entitled, not, so much privilege and access to resources that so many people haven't had in their lives, and really recognizing that deep inequity in the world. And where can I best invest my time and add value in a way that's humble, respectful, and does make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
So my journey really has been learning about that and where I best fit and where I can add value. And I started with the SVRI in 2006. It was first established in 2003 on the shoulders of incredible women that recognized the real difference in the way in which research resources were shared and dispersed from high-income countries to lower middle-income countries, with most of those resources still sitting in high-income countries, whereas low middle-income countries like us in South Africa really have the highest burden but the least resources to better understand what works and what doesn't to prevent and respond to violence against women, for example. So it was against that background that the SVRI was established. And we still have that aim and vision to really advance knowledge on how to build better programs for women survivors in low and middle income countries to prevent and respond to violence against women. And so we do that in multiple ways. We work around building evidence and we provide an annual grant around that. We also have a knowledge hub and we have a membership of over 8,000 to 9,000 people where we share current resources and happenings within the field around what is happening, because we really want people to know that there is really good work going on and there's excellent work going on in low and middle income countries, and we want to share that and showcase the work. Like you were saying, how do we build from the great successes and the learnings from South Africa and ensure that they are shared globally, as well as how can we learn from the global learnings and add them and to advance the work that we're doing in South Africa. And the SVRI is a real scaffolding, field building organization that works to promote that networking, that learning and that sharing. So we do that around building evidence. We also have a capacity strengthening pillar around which we have recently just launched an online learning platform. And on that online learning platform are free courses for anybody who's interested to look at how do we ensure the research findings make a difference. So it's called Pathways for Research Impact. We also have a course on violence against children measurement and tools, which I think is really incredibly important. So what are the existing tools and how do we measure it? Because if we can't define it, we can't measure it. And so it's defining what it means and what are the tools that exist and how do we adapt those tools to different contexts to ensure that we are gathering good data, because good data is so important to influence and inform advocacy campaigns, as well as, to talk to policymakers. It's important to have some data and information around what's working, what's not, what are the size of the problem, where are the priorities lying, and where can we be investing really, really precious public health resources to ensure that we make the biggest difference for the most women and particularly in South Africa, where we have a very high burden. We also have a course looking at wellness and care and collective care within organisations like ourselves and yours. So we would love you to have a look at that, and if you're interested, work out ways that we can build and improve it. And then we have the promoting partnerships, and this is how we connected, is through the SVRI Forum, is where we bring the field together every 2 years, not just our field, but people all working to try and address this issue of violence, and particularly patriarchal violence, or the violence driven by gender inequality. And how do we end it? What do we do? So people come together every 2 years to share what we know, share what's not working, how to build and improve programs, how to engage across sectors. We all come with different languages, professional languages, human languages, our own different languages within our own sort of cultures and contexts. How do we start working together as a collective and a community to really come together? Because this is what the sort of social scientists call a wicked problem, a complex problem, and no one individual organisation, sector can really solve this problem. So we have to build community, and the SVRI Forum is a space, and we were talking about that earlier. It's like a festival of learning, a space where we all come together to share, connect, and learn. And our last one was just 4 weeks ago in Cancun in Mexico, and it brought together over 1,000 folk. And it was really good fun. It was a real celebration, and I'll talk more about that, I'm sure, in a bit. And then our final area of work is around influencing change, because we've got all this data, we've got all this research, the world is generating knowledge. And how do we ensure that knowledge is actually useful, the so what of research, and how do we do it in a way that is going to make an impact? So we have developed some advocacy tools, and they include looking at who is funding violence against women research. And the key message is, in terms of overseas development aid, the minuscule amount that goes to violence against women programming, even less of that goes to trying to work out what is effective and what isn't. And we really need to address that, because we need to invest in programs that are going to make a difference and do no harm. This is a complex area, and programs can be harmful. They can create backlash. They can hurt women. And so we really need to make sure we are ethical and thoughtful in the way in which we build programs. And we at the moment currently don't really have a program that we can take to scale easily. So also thinking through scaling up programs that we know are effective within one community, but how do we take it to scale? And that's not a unique challenge to the violence against women field. Social science programs that deal with humans, us, every day, are complex. And what is it? What is the magic sauce that really ensures that those programs are effective and continue to be respectful of the original aims of the program, and reach multiple people? Because that's our aim. We want to end violence, and by ending violence, we have to do a lot, often over a very long period of time. And so that means scaling up things that have been found to be effective. So we've tracked the funding. So we've identified that very little funding goes to low and middle income countries and on violence against women program, even less to research and evidence building and knowledge building. We have to also really think the way in which we do our evidence building and knowledge building. The first step, of course, is getting the resources to the people that can do the work. So our job is to make sure precious resources reach low and middle income country-based researchers and programmers and activists to build knowledge together, and that they have the funding to do it. So we've also worked out what does ethical funding look like in it for us? And so we did a very participatory process with multiple folk from around the world, over a series of dialogues over a year, to say, what is ethical funding? And really is more funding, better funding, funding that is longer term, core, not program linked, that is flexible. So, you know, Hazel, you in South Africa know best what you need to be funded, right? Why should I be, as a potential funder from a high income country, which I'm in South Africa, so that be the one that makes a decision about what should be funded? So we really want to disrupt the way in which funding is done as well. And we've got some really great guidance that was developed with funders, practitioners, activists, and researchers. And we're working a way of rolling that out and sharing that with the world around. There is a real strong, and the key thing that came out of the forum was there's a real strong discourse at the moment around better and more funding for the field. This is an issue that is profoundly impactful on all of us in societies, and it impacts on development, and it impacts on our mental health and our well-being, and it impacts on women's ability to interact in political discourse, in society generally, in employment. So it has to be addressed, and we can only do that with the right resources. There's also an interesting comparison. If you look at the sort of funders that fund the sort of anti-feminist movements, for example, in the global north, the sort of anti-LGBTQI plus movements, the anti-abortion and termination of pregnancy movements, those groups get 50-year funding, they get core funding, and they get to be able to use that in any way. And they're able to, what they call manufacture moral panic around particular issues. And we, in our field, the human rights field, the activist fields, the violence against women and gender-based violence prevention and response fields, we get 1 to 2 year funding. It's project funding. It's not core funding. It's not flexible. And how do we actually fight that? We have to know we have to be doing it better. And then finally, we have a whole series of priority setting for research that is currently underway. And that's saying the field, it's no longer the white woman in the room or the white man in the room or the most senior person in the room that's saying, these are the priorities for research. How do we ensure we get diverse voices documenting, identifying what's important at the ground level for them for research priorities? So we also have created a very participatory process, adapting a very rigorous tool for priority setting. And we've been doing that. We've set a global research agenda. We've worked, we don't do it, we steward the process. In Latin America and the Caribbean, we have a research priority setting that has just recently completed. We're working with UNICEF in Ochenti and WHO on intersections between violence against women and violence against children research agenda. And we're also working with UN Women and colleagues in the region for a Africa Shared Research Agenda. So I feel like I've just talked nonstop at you. I apologize. And I'm going to stop there.
No, absolutely not. As you're talking, in my mind, I'm thinking, how do I contain this conversation? Because I'm interested in knowing more about disruptive funding. I want to know about the capacity building. I want to go deeper into the innovation. You spoke about research priorities. Like, I'm so keenly interested, but we don't have the time. I wish we could have this conversation and go deeper into this. But it's so interesting what you're doing and the level and the depths that it's all encompassing. So it's not just research, it's influencing as well. It's innovation. There's just so much going on with SVRI. I would like to propose another conversation, but just to shift the conversation a bit, I want to kind of contextualize it now into the South African context, because we have the Presidential Summit on Gender-Based Violence coming up, the second summit. And the summit actually brings everybody within the landscape, and we're having conversations. We're being held accountable. We've got milestones. We've got strategy around it. How are we bringing this together? As SVRI, your focus is mainly on middle to low classes, and I think you mentioned why, because it's the most burdened and under-resourced. When we look at the statistics around gender-based violence, pre and post-COVID, South Africa, obviously, our stats went way up. How do we compare that with the rest of the world? Is it only in South Africa where we've had an escalation with gender-based violence, or do we see the very same movement throughout the whole world, globally?
Hazel, we do have incredibly high rates of violence against women and violence against children. And I don't know if the COVID has escalated or changed that. I feel like we just have really high rates for a whole multiple set of reasons. And, you know, but globally there are the estimates that World Health Organization through their national surveys, the WHO surveys, have identified between 1 and 3 women have experienced violence throughout their lifetime. And we don't have a national survey in South Africa, but we pretty much have high levels of violence and probably higher levels. So if you look at some of the sort of provincial studies that have been done, and I do believe the HSRC in South Africa is undertaking a global study, I mean, a national study to look at the statistics and potentially, I don't know where they're at with that, but maybe you do. But in terms of what we do know, you know, our femicide rates are massively higher than the global average. I think it's something like 6 times the global average. So we really have to intervene and prevent violence. I think that this year we had, you know, just between January and June, I think something like just under 2,000 women being murdered. And that's outrageous, and we have to do something. And, you know, and I think we are. I mean, I think what is great about the GBV Femicide Summit and the sort of real commitment by the government to address this issue shows how much commitment there is to address the issue. So I think that we are in a good space, and I think this national summit is a really important opportunity. It's the second one. We also have an opportunity to see how far we've come and what we need to be doing now. And I think that there's been some real collective conversations between the first one and the second one, and I think we know a lot more. I'm part of a South African initiative called the Violence Prevention Forum, which is an incredible group of policymakers, government people, academics, activists, the NGO sector, all working together. And it's a very slow, dialogic, facilitated process to really bring together the different voices, because as we already spoke about, and as you were saying, is that we can't do this alone. So we have to do it as a collective. But again, bringing people together takes time. You have to build trust. And so the forum is about that process. And one of the key outcomes has been building the trust and building a network, as well as building a real shared understanding of what violence prevention means to that group, and then working together to share tools and ideas and thoughts with the different stakeholders around how can we together prevent violence. And I know that we will be, the Violence Prevention Forum, hosting a workshop at the Global Summit. So that's super exciting. So hold this space. I don't quite have the details of that yet. I think that the presidency is having a briefing with the people running workshops on Monday. So it's all happening right now. It's super exciting.
It's all coming together. Sorry, I couldn't find my mute button. It's all coming together. One of the themes that came, I just want to talk about Cancun a bit, our Mexico trip. One of the themes that came up, or discussions that came up through the conference, is what works and what doesn't work when it comes to the prevention of violence against women. We also want to learn these lessons, what doesn't work and what works, from a prevention and response perspective. Like, do we continue doing? Do we continue to do more research? What works, what doesn't work? Do you mind sharing a bit more what came out from that conference?
Well, I think as a field we're learning, the really good learning is that we can prevent violence. and that violence against women can be prevented. And what's really important is that we've also learned is that violence can be prevented if we understand the drivers of violence and what is the underlying factors that create a society which provides impunity for violence against women. And so I think the important thing, first step of a violence prevention program, which I do really believe that is happening in South Africa, is a real deep understanding of what is it about South African society that is driving violence in a South African context. And the Violence Prevention Forum has done a lot of work around that. And so programs have to be firmly rooted in the understanding of those drivers. And once we understand those drivers, then we can begin a building block of programs. No one program will address every driver, but a multiple set of programs put together can be together a scaffolding effect to begin addressing those drivers. Would it be helpful just to sort of highlight some of the drivers that we are aware of as the Violence Prevention Forum are specific to a South African context?
Yes,
Yes,
sorry.
I think solos definitely.
Sorry. So from the Violence Prevention Forum and the work that, over many years, and the sort of, because actually the Violence Prevention Forum is a collective working to apply evidence-informed programs and practice and put into policy. And so the drivers that we've identified within South Africa is the sort of very violent history of colonialism and apartheid, and that the sort of normalization of the use of violence to resolve conflicts, and really to express power or discontent, and that also has translated into the relationships and how we relate to each other.
Mm-hmm.
We also know we have high levels of gender inequality, the sort of social norms around, and high-level social norms around, sort of the roles of men and women in society. And we have high levels of racism, high levels of xenophobia. And we have sort of weak governance and patriarchal privilege throughout a South African society. Mm-hmm. Historically, welfare has really neglected Black communities, and that still remains neglected. So the mental health care and support is not available for the large majority of South Africans. And that's a real failure of the system. We also know that this history of state-sanctioned violence and racial inequality is a key driver of violence within a South African society. And we have high levels of poverty, inequality, and food insecurity. And that across the world is a key driver of violence against women. And so we really need to address issues of poverty in our society. And our families and our communities are really fragile. They are, sort of one shock to a family or a community and they break. And so we don't have societies or families that are able to deal with, a death in the family is going to cost a lot of money, for example, or a long-term illness, or if the main caregiver gets put in jail or gets really sick. Those sorts of shocks, we don't have resilience within our families and communities. And so those are some of the key drivers that have been identified. In the sort of global literature, these drivers do translate. So in terms of sort of at a societal level, poverty and gender inequality are key drivers. At a sort of individual community level, issues around mental health and well-being, relationship quarreling within relationships and communication skills within relationships. There's also issues around the sort of certain marginalized or groups that haven't necessarily have access to resources or have particular vulnerabilities, like people with disabilities or LGBTQI+ populations also are exposed to different and high levels of violence. And we also know that in areas where there's a humanitarian crisis, that violence against women and violence against children increases. And I would also sort of posit that, you know, we have levels of violence that would be similar to humanitarian or conflict states in South Africa. And so that's something we need to consider as a country around, are we still living through, are we in the post-conflict phase? And addressing the issue of the conflict and apartheid and the state-sanctioned violence as a potential, I mean, as a, not a potential, as a key driver that also we have to acknowledge and somehow address. And so all of these factors need to be addressed through different types of interventions and programs. Some of the programs that we know that are effective are community-based social norms change programs. There are models, but they need to be adapted to different contexts. You can't just import a program and say it's going to work here. So you have different cultures, languages, experiences, different social norms that drive the violence. And the drivers of violence in South Africa are very different to what would be driving violence in, say, Botswana, for example. And so we have to adapt these programs. So there's a program called SASA that was developed in Uganda that has been taken, they have been scaling across different countries around the world quite effectively. There are parenting interventions and programs. Early intervention is really important, and I think they have the potential to have the best return on your investment. I don't want to put financial terms on lives of women and children, but parenting and early childhood development programs are really powerful tools. But the parenting programs have to be gendered. They have to recognize that the patriarchal social norms that we are born into manifest in families and how we parent our children and how we interact as a family. And so we need to be aware of how social norms influence the way a mother will be parenting a child, for example. And often we talk about violence against children and we only measure violence against children perpetration by the mother. We don't ask about who's hitting, we don't ask about father's violence to children either. So we really have to be, when we're looking, evaluating and understanding family violence, we have to look at the different forms of perpetration of violence and who is the perpetrator. We also need more work on perpetration. Who are the perpetrators? What are their drivers? Better understanding that, and we need to bring men into the discourse as allies and also programs for perpetrators as well. We have, that's a massive gap, I think, in the evidence base. We also know the cash transfers, grants can reduce the issues around addressing poverty and food insecurity. Personally, if we could, I would say just give everybody money. It does, and I mean, just everybody, just give everybody money. Let's take the money from the really wealthy billionaires that are out there, those, you know, that 0.1% that own all the wealth, and just share it. Just give everybody money. But I know that's possibly not the simplest intervention. Well, I think it's the simplest intervention, but I'm quite sure how to do it. But I think providing people with money and allowing them to work out what they want to do with it and trusting people to use the money that works best for them and not having a kind of like a expectation that they should do this or that with the money, because we know that if you give people money, they pretty much use it really responsibly. Women and men let's trust people to know what's best for them. So cash transfers have been found to be highly effective. Again, our struggle is how to take these to scale and what works and what doesn't work at scale, and why. So there are different interventions. There's been sort of partner relationship interventions that have been found effective in one setting and found ineffective or has increased violence in other settings for a whole variety of reasons. So this is a complex issue. And what is that magic sauce that we need to find? Who is it? What is it that makes programs effective at scale? So that's where we're at. And the other issue around the forum was that, like I was talking about earlier on, is around funding, the funding ecosystem, and how do we transform that to ensure that we have sustainable community-based programs and NGOs and women's rights organizations, because they are essential in the work. And at the moment, the NGO sector, particularly in South Africa, is very fragile, highly underfunded, and at the whim of external funders. So one day they'll get funding and the next day it's gone. And that's really stressful for them, of course, and not sustainable. And we need to ensure civil society is vibrant, has a voice, and is well funded and supported.
Liz, you said something very interesting which piqued my interest when you commented that South African communities are actually quite fragile and not as resilient. And so that caught my attention, because we often think of ourselves as a very resilient people. And I don't know if part of that narrative comes from the idea that apartheid didn't crush us and therefore we are resilient. So maybe people are defining this or appreciating resilience in different ways. So I'm very keen to hear from you, particularly around your definition of resilience and why you're saying South African communities are not actually as resilient as maybe is this common knowledge fact, but may not actually be a fact at all.
It's a great question. I feel like we talk about resilience, that we need to be careful about how we talk about resilience as always a good thing. Because of resilience, I have no doubt that South African societies are very resilient, but is that okay? We're resilient in the face of incredibly adverse situations and experiences, and lots of toxicity and lack of resources. And yes, resilient people are getting up, they're doing their thing day to day, but actually resilience almost says, that's great that you're resilient, because now you can cope with the terrible environment within which you live and continue to survive. What we want is people to thrive, not just survive. I think resilience is important, and it's a really important life skill, but it shouldn't be at the cost of our mental health and well-being and our ability to continue to thrive and provide children with schooling and opportunities and education and food, basic needs. And so it's rethinking how we perceive and understand resilience. And I think there's a lot of thinking out there at the moment. I'm not up to date with the literature, but I do feel like we need to acknowledge and embrace our resilience, but also acknowledge and embrace the fact that people's lives living on the ground in communities in South Africa is really hard, and they are being resilient in the face of incredible hardships. But is that okay? And is that the type of society that we want? And if we don't address that, and if we don't address the social norms that drive violence, and if we don't address the high levels of poverty and inequality and food insecurity that are being faced by communities in South Africa, we're going to continue to have high levels of violence.
So I'm hearing that, and I love that you're bringing this up, because it's one of those things that swirl around in my mind, but I don't even know, because it's such a controversial notion. So I love that we can have this conversation here, because there's a lot of resilience training work happening in the world. In fact, Mental Wellness Initiative does some resilience work with leaders within the social justice sector, but we combine resilience with healing. So we're trying to bring healing to it, and not just say, you need to learn new ways to endure intolerable circumstances.
Yes.
And
so
I
there's a
love
different
that you
way of
said
understanding
that.
it, really.
Yeah. This notion that the more resilient we are, the more we can just absorb these intolerable conditions, these degrees of toxicity that no human being should be required to endure. So is it possible that this exaggerated notion of resilience actually becomes something that drives human rights violations, in a sense? Because it gets us to turn a blind eye to things that should systemically change, but we don't change them because they're resilient, so we could just move on.
Yeah, they're just coping. It's fine. They're not thriving, but they're surviving. I think also the sort of resilience work that is trauma informed is very powerful. That recognizes trauma, addresses the trauma, and addresses those inequalities and the experiences that people have faced. So it's not throwing resilience out. It's just, again, recognizing that resilience may enable us to survive, but it doesn't. And maybe sort of, allow, as you say, acceptance of intolerable systemic issues that really need to be broken down and rethought and rebuilt.
Thanks, Liz. That was massively insightful for me. Hayes?
I think, Liz, thank you for touching on that, because before we started our meeting, we spoke about how you cannot speak about GBVF and not talk about mental wellness. An absolutely key important element. The two are intertwined. Now coming back to SVRI, the organization creates innovation, informed or well-researched innovation to support the gender-based violence initiatives throughout the world. What are some of these innovations that are supporting the GBV space and that we can import as well to South Africa?
So we do grant making, as I said. So there's some great pieces of research that we support that are collaborative processes. So we really try to support low and middle income country led conceived research, and that research is done in partnership with researchers, practitioners, policymakers, where appropriate and possible, and that there is a view to try and ensure that the research findings get into the discourse of policymakers and programmers where it can have a greater impact. So sort of the types of work, for example, is a piece of a study with between the government of Peru and researchers looking at ways to support and train police officers. And they've developed an evidence-based training program and manual that the Peruvian government have taken on board and will scale up throughout their entire police force. So that was a piece of research that influenced the way in which government works with their police force, for example. There's some work being done on the role of mental health and the importance of mental health care and support with men in Kenya, and how the mental health intervention, which was a WHO mental health program that was adapted for men around alcohol abuse and etc. Also was effective in reducing alcohol, providing support networks for men in that community. And there was a promising finding of potential reduction of intimate partner violence, but these studies are small because our grants aren't big. So it's the idea of identifying potentially, effective programs, and then finding more, helping those groups to find more resources to build up the evidence, because we don't want to have small evidence, influencing programs. We want really rigorous evidence-based influencing programs. But what we find really important is ensuring practitioner voices and knowledge-based practice is informing the research and the outcomes, so that those stories, we're saying it, it's hard to quantify human experiences. So what's really important is the qualitative work that we have the stories from the practitioners and the women on the ground around the experiences of violence, of programs, what works for them, what doesn't, what do they need. And so firmly centering women's voices in all our research is really important. We also looked at a program that was an agricultural program, also in Kenya, interestingly enough, that had not measured in their programs intimate partner violence or violence in the home, domestic violence. And when they put the measure in, they found that the levels of violence, they had done great in increasing the the sort of the financial healthiness of families through this agricultural program, but they hadn't influenced or impacted on levels of violence at all. So they adapted their program now to have a gender component as well to address. So there are important things of us just asking the question can really influence and improve programs. So those are the sorts of programs that we have been funding. The other area that we are working to innovate and influence, as I was talking, is really around the mechanisms, the way in which the field is funded, and advocating for a sea change in the way that we fund this work, and that we really need to be putting the funding firmly in the hands of low and middle income country folk, not high income country extractive programs. Not that I'm saying that all high income country research coming into South Africa, for example, or, you know, Peru or Colombia or, you know, Samoa is extractive, because it's not. It's just, I think better research is done when it's led locally and in partnership with high income countries, with capacity strengthening and sharing and all that really good stuff. Co-sharing, co-creation is really powerful. But we want the resources, and we want the resources built on the ground.
Okay.
That's our passion.
So essentially the innovation is led by the lead on the ground.
Perfect.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So as we're closing, I just wanted to find out from you, how do organizations get involved? Those that want to be part of the network, part of the forum, how do they get involved?
They can join the SVRI network, which really means signing up to our listserv, which is, they can just send us an email. They can visit the website, www.svri.org, or send an email to svri@svri.org. And we will sign you up, and then you will be part of the SVRI, and we will welcome you. We love it. We love people joining us. And for the forum, we have the next forum will be in South Africa in October 2024. So put it in your budgets, put it in your plans, and join us. We haven't got the firm dates yet, but we will be sharing that via the update. So join us.
2024, all roads lead to SVRI.
Yes, the Festival of Learning.
Yes, Festival
love
of
that.
Learning.
I love that. Thank you for that. That's your gift to me.
Yes, Festival of Learning. Thank you
The Festival
so
of
much.
Learning.
So I just had a question from somebody. Sorry, they sent me a message. They wanted to find out, SVRI speaks about emerging researchers. They have a program for emerging researchers. How do emerging researchers also get involved? How do they?
So, okay, again, through the update, but also at the forum, we really prioritize the bursaries for new and emerging researchers. We also have a young professionals program, which people can apply to be a part of, which is pretty much culminates at the forum. So I think we put out the call, probably we'll put it out early 2024.
Okay.
But if there is young researchers out there doing this work, and they feel like they're not part of a network, they join the SVRI, because this is your home. Come and join us. And if you can send me an email, elizabeth@svri.org, and I can link you up with other people doing similar research, or practitioners doing similar work, and you can create a community through that as well. So that we are really good at linking people up doing similar work. So let us know, reach out.
Lovely. From Collective Action Magazine, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for indulging us.
Thank
we look
you.
forward to seeing you. Hopefully you'll be there at the summit. If not, we'll see you in 2024 and in between.
Okay, I'll see you at the summit, but I'll see you also hopefully before 2024.
Yeah, hopefully.
See you at the summit, definitely.
See you at the summit.
Bye.